Have you ever stood at the edge of a nightmare and wondered if you'd step into it or turn and run? Imagine a hospital engulfed in flames, its walls crumbling under a relentless inferno, and one man, a firefighter, racing through the chaos to save a stranger's life. On a night that began like any other in downtown Los Angeles, Isaiah Brooks faced that very abyss. The fire roared like a living beast, but his heart pounded louder, fueled by a courage he didn't yet know would change everything. An elderly woman's desperate gaze met his through the smoke, and in that fleeting moment, their fates intertwined. This isn't just a story, it's a pulse-pounding journey of sacrifice, a tale that will sear itself into your soul. Welcome to Daily Narrated Stories, where we uncover the raw, unshakable spirit of everyday heroes. The evening had draped Station 19 in a deceptive calm, a stillness that prickled Isaiah's skin like a warning whispered in the dark. He sank onto his cot, the day's weight pressing into his bones, a smoldering attic fire, a child trembling in a tree, small battles that left their mark. Outside, the faint hum of tires on wet pavement mingled with the rhythmic drip of a faucet in the break room, a quiet metronome to the crew's low murmurs as they traded tales of the shift. Isaiah stretched, his joints cracking like dry twigs, and rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling a slow, weary breath. Maybe tonight, he thought, the city would grant them peace. Maybe tonight, he could close his eyes without the echo of sirens in his dreams. Then it came, a shriek that shattered the silence, an alarm so piercing it jolted his spine straight and sent adrenaline surging through his veins like wildfire. The station erupted in a heartbeat. Boots slammed against concrete. Shouts ricocheted off the walls. Lockers clanged as gear flew into place. Isaiah sprang up, yanking on his jacket with hands that moved by instinct, his helmet snapping secure, gloves tugged tight over calloused fingers. His team flowed around him like a single organism, honed by years of drills, jackets zipped, helmets fastened, every motion a testament to their unspoken bond. The dispatcher's voice sliced through the intercom, sharp and unyielding. Major blaze, downtown Los Angeles. Rapid spread hitting homes and Grace Memorial Hospital. Patients unaccounted for. Every unit, roll out now. The words landed like a spark on dry grass, igniting the air with urgency. Isaiah's pulse hammered in his ears, a war drum drowning out the world. A hospital fire wasn't just flames. It was lives tethered to machines, elderly souls too frail to flee, nurses too stubborn to abandon their posts. This was no ordinary call. It was a race against a clock with no mercy. The fire trucks roared from the bay, their sirens cutting through the night like a warrior's cry, a sound that vibrated in his chest as he gripped the rail at the truck's edge. The city streaked past in a blur, neon signs bleeding into shadow, streetlights smearing into streaks of gold, and ahead, a dark tide of smoke rising over the horizon, staining the sky like spilled ink. The acrid stench of burning wood and molten plastic clawed at his nostrils, a bitter promise of the hell awaiting them. As they rounded the final corner, the sight hit him like a fist to the gut. Grace Memorial, once a sanctuary of healing, now a towering pyre. Flames gnashed at its walls, clawing upward with savage hunger, windows exploding outward in jagged bursts of glass that rained onto the pavement below. The night sky glowed a sickly crimson, embers swirling like fallen stars caught in a storm. Screams pierced the air, raw and desperate, tangling with the relentless wail of sirens into a symphony of terror. The ground was a battlefield. Firefighters sprinted through the chaos, hauling hoses that snaked like lifelines, smashing doors with axes, guiding soot-streaked patients toward waiting ambulances. A nurse stumbled past, her scrubs smeared with ash, dragging a frail man in a flapping gown, his eyes wide with a hollow, unseeing shock. Smoke poured from the upper floors, thick and suffocating, a black shroud that swallowed the stars. Isaiah's radio crackled to life, his captain's voice cutting through the din. "Brooks, take your team. Clear floors 3 and 4. Move fast. We're losing her." "Got it," Isaiah barked, yanking his mask over his face. The axe slung over his shoulder a familiar weight, its heft a silent reassurance. Every second was a life slipping through his fingers, a debt he couldn't bear to leave unpaid. He pushed through the hospital's shattered entrance, and the heat slammed into him like a wall. A physical blow, thick and oppressive. The air a gritty slurry of ash and despair. The sprinkler system hung limp, its pipes dry and useless, leaving the fire to feast unchecked. Walls groaned under the strain, paint blistering into curling black strips, ceiling tiles crashing to the floor in bursts of dust and flame. His squad spread out with practiced precision, a unit bound by trust. Patients shuffled toward the stairwell, their footsteps unsteady, their faces etched with fear. Isaiah steadied an old man, his arms mottled with fresh burns, his breath a shallow wheeze that barely rose above the chaos. "Hang on, sir, we've got you," Isaiah said, his voice a steady anchor as the floor trembled beneath them, a warning rumble of the building's weakening spine. The stairwell held, for now, a narrow mercy in a night offering little else. He guided the last of the evacuees down, their hands clutching at his gear, their gratitude unspoken but heavy in their eyes. But as the final figure disappeared into the shadows below, Isaiah paused, his gaze piercing the haze. Something tugged at him, a pull deep in his gut, a whisper that he wasn't done. A nurse emerged from the smoke, her face pale beneath a mask of soot, her fingers digging into his arm with a trembling urgency. "Up there, room 315, she gasped, her voice breaking between coughs. "An old woman, leg in a cast. She's trapped. She won't make it unless." Her words faltered, her eyes pleading through the grime, a silent scream that struck him like a blade. He didn't let her finish. His radio buzzed, his captain's voice sharp with alarm. "Brooks, get out now. It's spreading too fast. We're losing the building." A flicker of doubt shadowed his mind. His team stood at the stairwell's edge, their faces taut with worry, their hands reaching as if to pull him back. Going up was a death wish, a gamble where the odds were stacked against him. But standing still? That was a betrayal of the man he'd sworn to be, a violation of the vow etched into his soul. "I'm in," he said, his voice forged in steel, cutting through the static like a lifeline. A teammate lunged forward. "Isaiah, wait." But he shook off the grip, already charging up the stairs. Each step groaned beneath his boots, a creak of defiance against the fire's relentless hunger. Smoke coiled around him like living hands, tendrils tightening with every breath, heat searing through his gear until it felt like his skin might blister and peel. His lungs clawed for air behind the mask, the taste of ash sharp and bitter on his tongue. The third floor was a furnace, a hellscape where flames danced with savage glee, licking at the walls with tongues of red and gold that shimmered in the haze. The air wavered with heat, distorting the world into a nightmare of shadow and light. Room 315 loomed through the murk, its door a faint outline in the swirling smoke. Isaiah shouldered it open with a grunt, the wood splintering under his force. There she sat, Margaret Pierce, frail and hunched on her hospital bed, her right leg locked in a thick plaster cast that gleamed white against the blackened ruin around her. Her eyes met his, wide and glistening with a terror that sliced through the haze, sharper than the fire's roar. I can't move," she rasped, her voice a fragile thread nearly lost to the chaos, trembling with a fear that mirrored the quake in her hands. Time froze. Isaiah's mind raced, a storm of instinct and resolve. He checked his gear with swift precision, fireproof blanket tucked at his side, protective vest snug against his chest, oxygen mask humming faintly over his face. Then came the jolt, a cold punch to his gut. He had no spare mask. The realization hit like a wave, unyielding and brutal, but he didn't falter. His hands moved before his mind could argue, tearing his own mask free with a sharp tug, the cool rush of filtered air replaced by the raw, choking burn of smoke that flooded his lungs. He knelt beside her, securing it over her face with steady hands, his fingers brushing her trembling cheek. "Breathe slow," he commanded, his voice firm and unshaken despite the sting clawing at his throat, the first bite of the poison he'd invited in. Her eyes flickered with something, gratitude, disbelief, a spark of hope, as she nodded weakly, her hands clutching the mask like a lifeline. Isaiah crouched low, sliding his arms beneath her, lifting her onto his back with a gentleness that belied the chaos threatening to swallow them whole. Her trembling arms looped around his neck, fragile as a bird's wings, her casted leg dangling uselessly against his side. "Hold on tight, ma'am. We're getting out of here," he said, the words of vow carved into the air, a promise he'd die to keep. As he stepped back into the hallway, the building seemed to scream. A ceiling beam crashed down just yards away, fire spitting embers like venom, a wall of flaming debris blocking the stairwell he'd climbed. The floor shuddered beneath him, a deep, guttural rumble that felt like the earth itself was surrendering. Isaiah grit his teeth, jaw tight with resolve. He'd made a promise, not just to her, but to the man who'd raised him, a firefighter whose voice echoed through the years. "Fire's not your enemy, son. Fear is. Face it." That memory burned brighter than the blaze, a torch in the suffocating dark, guiding him forward as he pushed through the choking haze. The heat was a living thing, pressing against him with relentless fury, seeping through his gear to blister the skin beneath, a searing weight that made every breath a jagged stab of pain. Smoke swirled in dense, choking clouds, reducing his world to a few hazy feet. His vision blurred, tears stinging his eyes as the air turned toxic. Margaret's weight settled into his shoulders, her frail grip tightening with every shudder of the floor, her shallow breaths a rhythm against his back. Behind him, the fire roared with a hunger that seemed personal, as if it knew he was stealing something from its grasp. The walls, once sturdy, groaned like wounded animals, their surfaces peeling away in charred strips, revealing the skeletal frame beneath. The stairwell he'd used was gone. Flames danced where it once stood, a writhing wall of red and gold that mocked his escape with its impenetrable glow. Isaiah's mind spun, pulling up every detail he'd memorized from the station's endless training drills. Every exit, every corridor, every weak point of Grace Memorial. There was another way out, a service exit on the opposite side, past the old imaging suites and through a maze of narrow halls. It was a long shot, a fragile thread of hope woven through a tapestry of ruin, but it was all he had left. Margaret coughed weakly against his shoulder, the oxygen mask hissing faintly as it filtered the poison from her lungs. "Are we going to make it?" she whispered, her voice soft and frayed, a plea wrapped in despair. Isaiah tightened his hold, shifting her weight to steady her. "I gave you my word, didn't I?" he said, his tone unwavering even as doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve, a quiet whisper asking if he'd misjudged the beast they faced. A loud crack split the air, an overhead beam buckled, sending a cascade of burning debris tumbling just feet behind them. The impact rocked the floor, a shockwave of heat blasting forward, searing the exposed skin of his neck and hands where his gear left gaps. Isaiah flinched, a sharp hiss escaping his lips as pain flared, but he pushed through it, driven by a will forged in years of facing down flames. His boots thudded against the trembling floor, each step a defiance against the chaos closing in. The hallway ahead was a graveyard of destruction, rubble strewn across the tiles, broken glass glinting like jagged teeth, a minefield that threatened to trip him with every move. He stepped with precision, his body straining under the dual burden of her weight and the fire's relentless advance. The fire alarm wailed overhead, a piercing shriek that drilled into his skull, an eerie soundtrack to the unfolding nightmare. The hospital walls, once sterile and white, were now blackened and crumbling, deep cracks snaking along their surfaces like veins pulsing with despair. The structure was losing its fight. Isaiah could feel it in the way the floor vibrated, in the groans of steel bending under heat it was never meant to withstand. His radio crackled to life, barely audible over the roar. "Brooks, where the hell are you? Talk to me." His captain's voice was tight with an urgency that sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Isaiah's veins. He lifted the radio, coughing as smoke clawed at his throat, and rasped, "Third floor, still inside." Before he could elaborate, a deafening explosion tore through the floor below, a sledgehammer blow that sent him staggering forward. The shockwave hit like a tidal wave, throwing Isaiah against the wall, his shoulders slamming into charred plaster as he shielded Margaret with his body. Dust and smoke billowed around them, a blinding storm that swallowed the hallway whole. The floor tilted ominously, a groan of protest from the dying building, and in that chaotic moment, Isaiah realized the worst. The service exit was gone. The explosion had ripped through the lower levels, obliterating the path he'd pinned his hopes on. Where a hallway once stretched toward freedom, there was now a gaping void, fire raging on the other side like a taunting wall. Margaret's trembling breaths pressed against his neck, quick and scared, her fear a mirror to the cold dread creeping into his chest. For the first time, he felt it fully. Fear, sharp and unyielding, threatening to paralyze him. But fear wasn't an option, not with her clinging to him, not with the promise he'd made echoing in his ears. Isaiah clenched his jaw, forcing his mind to sharpen, to find a way where none seemed to exist. He turned, eyes darting through the haze, scanning for any sliver of salvation. There, a window, its glass intact but warped from the heat, a fragile beacon in the chaos. He lurched toward it, boots skidding on the soot-covered floor, every step a battle against the exhaustion sinking into his bones. The fire roared louder behind him, a beast sensing its prey slipping away, its heat a suffocating force that pressed against his back. He raised his elbow and slammed it into the glass, shattering it outward in a rain of jagged shards that clattered onto the fire escape below. A gust of fresh air rushed in, cool and crisp against his sweat-drenched skin, a fleeting balm that cut through the oppressive heat. It was a lifeline, however brief. His lungs seized it, gasping against the raw burn of smoke, though the relief was tainted by the acrid stench still clinging to the night. Margaret coughed, her head lifting weakly against his shoulder. "Go. Leave me, son," she whispered, her voice breaking with a mix of despair and resolve. "You won't make it carrying me." Isaiah's chest tightened, frustration flaring hot and fierce. "Not happening," he growled, his tone a blade cutting through her plea. He hoisted her higher, stepping onto the ledge with a steadying breath. The fire escape loomed below, rusted, precarious, barely clinging to the building's side. It groaned under his weight as he tested it, a creak that sent a shiver of doubt through him. Behind them, the fire surged, a living wall of flame that seemed to pulse with intent, its roar drowning out the world. Isaiah took one last gulp of air and stepped forward, the fire escape trembling beneath his boots. The night air was a stark contrast to the inferno at his back. Cool, sharp, but heavy with the stink of burning ruin. Margaret's frail body trembled against him, her fear a tangible weight, her shallow breaths a constant reminder of the stakes. The narrow staircase descended into darkness, barely visible through the thick haze, flames reflecting off the hospital's remaining windows in jagged, flickering shadows that made every step feel like a plunge into the unknown. Isaiah moved with care, his hands gripping the rusted rails, the metal scorching even through his gloves. Time was a blade at their throats. The fire was relentless, devouring everything in its path, weakening the building's core with every passing second. A sudden crack split the air, an explosion ripped through the hospital's lower floors, its force sending a shockwave through the walls. The fire escape lurched violently, bolts screeching as they strained against their moorings. Isaiah instinctively wrapped himself tighter around Margaret, bracing as the entire structure tilted, threatening to tear free and send them plummeting into the alley below. "Dear God," she gasped, her voice a thin thread of panic. "Hold on," he barked, tightening his grip, his legs burning as he forced himself down the ladder, each rung a test of endurance against the heat radiating upward. Halfway down, a section of the escape buckled, the rusted bolts snapped one by one, the screech of twisting metal a knife through the chaos. The platform tilted sharply, slamming Isaiah against the railing with a force that drove the breath from his lungs. Pain shot through his ribs, a blinding burst that blurred his vision, but he held on, one hand locked around the bar, the other securing Margaret against him. His radio crackled, static cutting through. "Brooks, do you copy? We're losing the building. Where are you?" His breath came in ragged gasps, each word a struggle. "Fire escape. Coming down." Above, a terrible groan rolled through the structure, deep and final. The building was collapsing, its weight too much for the fire-ravaged frame to bear. The alley below was still 20 feet away, a shadowed promise beneath the smoke. Waiting wasn't an option. Debris would fall, burying them in the rubble. Isaiah sucked in a sharp breath, adjusted his grip on Margaret, and made the choice. "We're jumping," he muttered, a prayer to the night. The world tilted as they plummeted, wind rushing against his face, the burning hospital vanishing above them. He twisted midair, angling his body to absorb the impact. They crashed onto the asphalt, rolling hard, the force knocking the air from his lungs. Margaret let out a sharp cry as they hit, but Isaiah barely registered it. His vision swam, edges darkening, pain a tidal wave drowning his senses. Somewhere in the distance, shouts swelled, footsteps pounded against pavement, flashing lights pierced the haze. Isaiah, strong hands grabbed him, voices yelling over the chaos. He tried to move, to focus, but his limbs were leaden, his ribs ached, his lungs burned. The world blurred around him, a cacophony of motion and sound. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Margaret being lifted onto a stretcher, her oxygen mask still secured to her face, a faint rise of her chest signaling life. Then everything faded to black. He woke to pain, a deep, aching throb pulsing through every inch of his body, radiating from his ribs, his back, his arms, everywhere. A steady beep 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 filled the air, rhythmic and constant, the unmistakable hum of hospital machines. His skin felt raw, as if it had been scraped against the fire itself. He tried to shift, but the weight pressing against his chest pinned him down, a dull sting accompanying every breath. Voices murmured nearby, distant yet familiar, cutting through the haze of unconsciousness. With effort, Isaiah forced his eyes open. The fluorescent lights above were blinding, their sterile glow making his vision blur before it slowly adjusted. The walls around him were white, clean, nothing like the scorched ruin he'd escaped. He was in a hospital, alive. His throat was dry, each swallow a scrape against the rawness inside him. Memories flooded back. The fire, the woman, the freefall into darkness. Did she make it? Before he could move, the door creaked open. A nurse entered, her steps soft but purposeful, followed closely by a man Isaiah didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, with sharp features and an air of quiet authority that seemed out of place amid the beeping machines. The man's eyes held something familiar, gratitude, relief, a weight that pinned Isaiah where he lay. "You're awake," the man said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, a tremor beneath the calm that betrayed the storm within. Isaiah tried to sit up, but the nurse was at his side in an instant. "Take it easy, Mr. Brooks. You took quite a beating." She adjusted the four in his arm, her expression softening with a warmth that felt like a lifeline. "You've been out for almost 24 hours. Isaiah sank back against the pillows, his mind sluggish but clawing toward one question. He turned to the stranger, his voice hoarse and rough as gravel. "The woman, did she?" A small smile tugged at the man's lips, softening the hard lines of his face, a flicker of light in his steady gaze. "She's fine, thanks to you," he said, the words heavy with meaning. He took a step closer, extending a hand with a quiet dignity. "Nathaniel Pierce." The name landed like a spark. Isaiah had heard it before, a whisper from newsreels and business pages, a billionaire whose shadow loomed large. He stared, confusion knitting his brow. "I don't understand." Nathaniel sat in the chair beside the bed, his gaze unwavering, piercing through the haze of Isaiah's exhaustion. "The woman you saved, her name is Margaret Pierce. My mother." He let out a breath, a slow exhale that carried the weight of a near loss, shaking his head slightly, as if still grappling with the reality. "The doctor said if you hadn't gone back for her, she wouldn't have made it. You risked everything, for a stranger." Isaiah swallowed, the words settling over him like a warm tide, soothing the ache in his chest. He hadn't known who she was, it hadn't mattered. "She wasn't a stranger," he murmured, his voice rough but sure, each syllable a testament to the truth he'd lived by. "She was someone who needed help." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or awe, a recognition of the man before him. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the bedside table with a deliberate care. "I know you didn't do this expecting anything," he said, his voice low and earnest, "but that doesn't mean I won't repay you." Isaiah frowned, shaking his head with a stubborn resolve. "That's not necessary." Nathaniel smiled faintly, a curve of his lips that held both gratitude and insistence. "Maybe not, but I insist." The nurse excused herself, slipping out with a quiet nod, leaving them alone in the sterile stillness. Isaiah hesitated, his fingers hovering over the envelope before finally lifting it. Inside was a letter, along with documents, bank statements, deeds, a staggering list of gifts that made his breath catch. His heart rate spiked as he scanned the words. Debts paid, his mother's mortgage cleared, a new home built for her in the neighborhood she'd always loved, a place where she could watch the sunrise without worry. And at the bottom, something even more overwhelming. A foundation, a firefighter relief fund named after him, a legacy etched in ink that stretched beyond the scars he bore. He blinked, his fingers tightening around the paper, the edges crinkling under his grip. "This is," he faltered, words failing him, his voice a whisper lost in the tide of emotion swelling within. Nathaniel leaned forward, his expression sincere, his eyes locking with Isaiah's in a moment of unspoken understanding. "You've spent your life protecting people," he said, his voice steady but rich with feeling. "It's time someone looked out for you." The weight of it hit Isaiah, not just the gifts, but the meaning behind them, a recognition of the battles he'd fought, the lives he'd touched. Emotions swelled in his chest, raw and unbidden, a tide he couldn't hold back, gratitude, pride, a quiet awe that something so vast could spring from the ashes of that night. He met Nathaniel's gaze, his voice hoarse but steady. "Thank you." Nathaniel nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that carried the depth of their shared moment. "No," he replied, his tone soft but firm. "Thank you." Isaiah Brooks never craved the spotlight. To him, firefighting was a calling, a pulse that beat stronger than any desire for glory, running into the blaze when others fled, just as his father had taught him beneath a sky streaked with dusk. "Face it, son." Yet, as he lay battered in that hospital bed, his body a map of burns and bruises earned carrying Margaret through a raging inferno, the world saw something more. News stations replayed the footage in an endless loop, firefighters hauling him from the wreckage, his gear blackened with soot, his body limp from exhaustion, a shield over the woman he'd refused to leave behind. A bystander's shaky video spread like wildfire across screens. The Guardian of Grace, they called him, a title that felt foreign to the man who'd simply done his job. Outside the hospital, the ground bloomed with flowers, roses and daisies left by strangers, letters scrawled in childish hands proclaiming him a hero, messages from fellow firefighters who knew the weight of the choice he'd made. Schools wove his story into lessons of courage, of selflessness, while social media flooded with his name, his face, his sacrifice, a ripple that grew into a wave, touching lives he'd never meet. But to Isaiah, it was never about the headlines. He'd done what his father, a firefighter whose boots he'd followed, had instilled in him years ago. "You don't run from the fire, son. You run into it." That vow, born under his dad's steady gaze, had carried him through the flames, through the fall, through the darkness that nearly claimed them both. Yet, as he stood before a crowd at the opening of the foundation bearing his name, a fund dedicated to supporting injured firefighters and their families, a legacy built from the ashes of that night, Isaiah felt the truth settle into his bones. Courage wasn't just about saving Margaret. It was about the spark he'd ignited, a light that urged others to be brave, to believe in something greater than themselves. That night, as he gazed out at the city skyline, the distant glow of streetlights flickering like embers against the dark, he understood the weight of what he'd become, not just a survivor, but a symbol of sacrifice, of resilience, of what it truly meant to stand tall when the world burned around you. What's your fire? What moment tested your strength, pushed you beyond what you thought you could bear? Share it with us. Let's lift each other up with the stories that define us. Here at Daily Narrated Stories, we bring you tales like Isaiah's, raw, real, and brimming with the unshakable spirit that lives in us all. These are the stories that remind us of our own strength, that call us to rise when the odds stack high. Don't let this moment slip away. Subscribe now, ring that bell, and join a community where courage isn't just celebrated, it's lived. The clock's ticking, the fire's burning. Be part of something bold, something that matters, today.